we have George Reese, CTO of enStratus, and also James Duncan, who is the VP Product Development for Joyent. Now, our subject this time is whether open APIs are enough to prevent locking. George is going to argue they are. James is going to argue they aren't. We're not going to use slides this time, and we're going to be 10 minutes each, is that right? So we'll put 10 minutes up on the clock. And George, please welcome George and James to the stage. Your 10 minutes starts now.
Thank you very much. Earlier today, John had mentioned he didn't want to get in the whole what is a cloud type thing. And the problem with both the earlier debate and this one is if you think the definition of cloud is problematic, the definition of open, you really don't want to go there. But unfortunately, I think I have to right now. Because the question is are open APIs really sufficient to prevent vendor lock-in in the cloud? And there are about a dozen APIs out there that are I'm thinking just at the infrastructure level. You get up at the software as a service level, there are probably hundreds, and they all have various levels of openness, all the way from one extreme of being purely open source under SAM's very strict terms of what it means to be open. And then there are others like the Amazon Web Services API that a lot of people are adopting, but nobody really knows what the state of the intellectual property on it is. I am going to take a weak view of what that is, and that open is really whatever enables you, almost a circular kind of argument. Open is whatever enables you to experience a level of freedom from the underlying technology that you're working with. And the obvious starting point is open source software. I've been involved with open source software since before there was open source as a term in the early 90s, doing games, online games, and releasing that software under free licenses. JDBC drivers in the late 90s, Dasein Cloud today. And the rationale across doing that at every point about this open concept, about making it available to people, is really around the idea of empowering them and enabling them with choice. I mean, the other stuff about it being free and that's all great, but it's this idea of choice. So when we look at the question of vendor lock-in with respect to cloud, what is going to give you that level of freedom that is going to enable you to move from Amazon to Rackspace, from Rackspace to Terramark, Terramark to ReliaCloud, ReliaCloud to Cloud Central, or from some sort of SaaS sugar CRM over to NetSuite to Salesforce.com. It turns out open source software isn't sufficient to doing that. It may be it's obviously a good thing. It can help with certain elements, but what really, really accomplishes the task of making sure that you can move from cloud provider A to cloud provider B is this idea that you can go in through an API that you understand and that other people can have access to independent of you, and pull that data out, interact with your infrastructure, and replicate whatever you've got in a secondary cloud. Now, you need other components. You need elements like you need, if you're running a Windows environment inside the Amazon cloud, for example, and you want the ability to move to Rackspace, what you're going to need is a Windows environment in both clouds. Once you've got the Windows environment in both clouds, if you got an open API and Chef and some tools to automate it, you're all set and done, because you've You got whatever you've got configured in Amazon. You interact with the APIs to move data from Amazon to Rackspace, and Chef configures that infrastructure for you, and you've got your infrastructure up and running again. Hopefully you've got a cloud DNS provider that also enables you to interact via APIs, so you can move the APIs, and that's all you need. It doesn't matter that it's Windows under the cover. This, I guess most people here would view that as a definition of not open. As long as it's some sort of, it could be a PHP application, could be .NET, could be a homegrown language that you wrote yourself. As long as you've got the API, you can make it run in both environments. So, the one problem with the analogy between open APIs and open source is that the problem of vendor lock-in that you worry about that open source helps deal with is this idea of I'm running on Windows in my data center, and I don't like the fact that Microsoft's coming to me and asking for new licensing terms, or they've they've executed some sort of BSA audit and fined me $50,000 because somebody lost their copy of their license, whatever. That isn't the issue that you're worried about when it comes to cloud computing. The issue of lock-in is actually much more serious in the cloud. If you are running on Windows and Microsoft were to go out of business, tomorrow you still open up the doors and have your Windows systems running just fine. You have to plan on a migration strategy away from Windows to whatever else you want to go to, but you survive. In the cloud, this is a much more significant problem. If you are running in Azure today and Microsoft goes out of business, let's pick somebody who's running on open source software, and I don't mean to pick on Microsoft or anybody. This applies to every cloud provider. So let's just pick one, cloud provider X. They're running on a pure open source stack, and they go out of business tomorrow. Unless you've been leveraging their open APIs to make them interoperate with another cloud provider, the fact that the whole stack you're operating on is open source is otherwise completely irrelevant. So to protect yourself against the real problem of vendor lock-in in cloud, you need to not only have access to the open APIs, but you need to actually leverage those open APIs, which is something different than you're used to doing in the open source world. In the open source world, you're often happy with, well, I'm running on a LAMP stack, so I know I have freedom. I don't necessarily intend to ever use that freedom, but I know I got it. In the cloud, you actually need to exercise your freedom every day because you risk every day being locked into a different cloud provider based on not malice on their part, not any sort of thing that you're traditionally worried about with proprietary software, but just the idea of a disaster happening to them or them going out of business. So I got a minute and a half left, and I'm done with my argument.
So you finished your argument. Thank you very much, George. And now against the argument of does open is all we need to prevent locking is open APIs is James Duncan. Oh, can we just reset the clock for 10 minutes? Perfect. James.
Great. Thank you. So I've been coming to OSCON for a while now, and with the exception of the last couple of years when I haven't been able to make it, it's come to represent an almost annual pilgrimage to Portland, where first we sort of discussed how to get open source adopted, and then after that we started to talk about where it was getting adopted. And I was sort of starting to hope that maybe it was time to sit back and enjoy the fact that it had been adopted. So while I'm delighted to be on the stage participating in this debate, I'm sort of vaguely disappointed that we're having the debate at all, and especially at the open source conference of all places. The question is posed, are open APIs enough to prevent lock-in? Well, in short, no. And it's not all that hard to understand why. In fact, anybody who's been in the open source community for any length of time will probably know these arguments like the back of their hand. First of all, I think we probably need to stop using the term open API. In a place like this, at an event like OSCON, it's very strange to use the term because they're not really open. And to explain why, I probably need to explain the provenance, or at least where the popularization of the term came from. So Flickr started around February of 2004. It was targeted at early adopters, people like me. I ran a photo site. It had annotations. I could resize images. And it did what it was supposed to do. It operated, but it was a gigantic pain. It was, I was always having to fix it, et cetera, et cetera. And then Flickr came along, and they offered me all these features that went far beyond anything I could do for myself. And it was a compelling offering, really compelling. But they were trying to convince me to give up my photos. Now, photos mean different things to different people. My wife tells me I can't value photos because I don't take many of them, whereas I look at her and think that she can't value any individual photo because she takes so many. The point is they're really a personal thing. And Flickr, in asking me to give up control of my photos, was in a sense asking me to give up control of my memories. The exchange that they were proposing for that was, I give them photos, they give me features. Now, for a lot of people, that was enough. The deal was good, and they were happy, and Flickr were happy, and everyone got the required amount of freedom. But to sweeten the deal for pedants like myself, they decided to improve on that situation. So about a year after they launched, they made all the functionality that was available on their website available in a structured, programmatic way to me without screen scraping. In essence, they opened up their API that they used to provide the service. Quite literally, they took a once-closed API and they made it open. Hence the term, open API. They documented it, they popularized it, and all you had to do was subscribe to and invest in the idea of Flickr. Now, to give an analogy and to pluck an example out of thin air, let's imagine a company builds a phone, and they decide to put a web browser on it and a calendar and an email client, and it sells millions. It sells like hotcakes. And then later on, they make it possible for anyone to use those same APIs that they used to write applications for it. They've done exactly what Flickr did. Now, we all know who I'm talking about, but what I don't want to suggest is that it's a bad thing that they did that. In fact, it's great. But they did it to encourage further adoption of the site and the phone, respectively. And to suggest that by making the API available, they've reduced the danger of lock-in borders on fantasy, I think. Unless it's over the last few years, the word open has been redefined to merely mean available. There's nothing about these open APIs that is any more open than the Win32 API. At its core, the Win32 API, of course, is an API for drawing rectangles on a screen and putting drawings inside them and letting you interact with those drawings in the same way that the Cocoa API is. It's not substantially different, at any rate. It's mostly documented, just like the Cocoa API, and it's available for free for anyone that wants to use it, also like the Cocoa API. All you have to do is invest in its use and subscribe to the idea. But would anyone seriously argue that either of those APIs frees you from lock-in of either of those vendors? Would anyone really suggest that the existence of that API means that the other vendor, if you build for one of them, you're not locked in? Enterprises building software on Win32 are committed to Win32. They're locked in. And similarly, small businesses building for Cocoa are locked into Cocoa. But unlike Apple or Microsoft selling you a platform or an operating system, the suggestion that these so-called open APIs protect you from lock-in is even more insidious. When I buy a copy of Windows or Mac OS X, I get to install it on a physical machine that I own. And this is true for Linux as well. It can't be taken away. It's there, physically, in the corner. And although almost inconceivable, should the vendor disappear and the service goes away, I still have the product. It's still tangibly installed on that machine in the corner. Now, in the case of many companies with an open API, if the company goes away, then the service goes away too, and I've lost my entire investment in it. Now, I work for a cloud computing provider. We provide a service, and the software that runs that service is not all open source. And that might appear like it jeopardizes my position up here on the stage. But I don't think it does, and here's why. I'm not arguing that lock-in might not be a fair exchange. I carry an iPhone, I have a Flickr account, I've got an iPad, which had the contents of this talk for a long time. There may be times when lock-in is the best and most sensible route. Just as when I go to work, I exchange my liberty for money. In the case of proprietary cloud products behind APIs, I exchange liberty for convenience. As a consumer, it's up to me to make that determination. It's up to me to decide if it's an appropriate trade-off. However, I think if, as a vendor, you're making the argument that because you provide an API, you're not locking customers in, then at best you're misleading them, and at worst, you're treating them as stupid. Now, customers aren't stupid. After 30 years of proprietary software, they know everything there is to know about being locked in. They know what it looks like, they know what it smells like, they know what it feels like. They know lock-in. But that doesn't change the fact that we're up here on this stage having this debate, and I'm kind of interested to know why. I fear it's because we're so caught up in this future, so subscribed to the idea of the cloud, that we're willing to do almost anything to make it happen and justify anything. The generation before mine got to define personal computing. They ended up creating value and opportunity, and they did some amazing things, but it's our turn now. And we get to define the cloud, all of us in this room. We're all part of that. And it's an exciting time to live in, and it's an exciting place to be. But we're getting to establish the next 30 years of computing, and I think that gives us a certain responsibility. There are some really good reasons why proprietary software exists, and some really good reasons why proprietary services can exist as well. But those reasons don't change the fact that proprietary software and proprietary services will lock you in. Now, in the open source community, there are politics, as there are in any community. There are those that take a harsher stance on what is or is not appropriate policy and behavior from a particular vendor. We've seen and we've heard the disagreements over the years, and we should be able to learn from the past rather than repeat those mistakes. So let's acknowledge that there is a place for truly open software services. And similarly, that there's value to be had in closed software services as well. And the APIs that are there make a service more accessible. There is no doubt in that. But let's not pretend that there's no moral dilemma to be found in providing a service that can be removed in a heartbeat. And let's not excuse ourselves from the burden of responsibility that we hold when we create a service that, should they go away, impact people's livelihoods and businesses. Above all, I think we should hold ourselves to the same intellectual rigor that we hold the likes of Microsoft to at this conference. We did it to them, we should do it to ourselves. Do open APIs prevent lock-in? Not even close. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I got to go first so I don't forget the question. So I got two questions, one for you, one for him. So your argument is that lock-in is a choice you make, and correct me if I'm, you said a lot, and it was a very good presentation, but your argument is that you accept lock-in, and it's a choice you make, and so that's the argument. And so, but what I would say, isn't it that, can I have my cake and eat it too? Right? I want this service, I'll accept that lock-in, but I also want some layer of abstraction that allows me to go to Flickr and Twitter. So let me get my second question, I'll get both answers. And George, are you saying that that open source APIs or open APIs give me the openness for that if I'm in Amazon, that somebody like GoGrid could, the fact that it's open, that other providers could play, and that kind of by the open nature of it gives me the ability to have that non-lock-in?
Yep.
Okay.
So my argument is that lock-in is there, and that's okay, but we need to acknowledge that it's there. What we shouldn't do is pretend that because everyone consumes a particular service that there is no lock-in to that service. For example, Eucalyptus exists, which is an open source implementation, of course, of the EC2 API, and that's fantastic. But I don't think that validates the EC2 API. I think that validates the open source process which wrote Eucalyptus. And I just think it's important that we recognize that and not get carried away in this idea of the cloud and open APIs are wonderful and they solve all our problems. They really don't. What solves our problems is competing implementations.
Does the abstraction of APIs, doesn't that solve our problem? The fact that we've abstracted multiple clouds in like a Dazen cloud or JCloud, does that give us value and the ability to move something if they are destroyed? Or
possibly, yes. But if that service, that in-between service is then a proprietary service, it just creates another layer of problem. It hasn't actually solved the problem. It just moves it.
George, I want to answer him the second question. The short answer is yes, but he uses the example of Win32 APIs, which actually I think are great for my argument.
I don't disagree. They are great, but
they're great for my argument here because Win32 APIs are exactly not open. There have been a lot of intellectual property battles fought around them, a lot of barriers put into place around them. And the reason that Linux as an alternative or FreeBSD or an open alternative is so important in that environment is because you were in a position as a user of Windows invested in Intel hardware to where you're at the whim of Microsoft in terms of the entire investment you've put into the platform. Whereas with the open source alternatives, I can move my applications from one flavor of Linux to another. I can do whatever I want with them. I can, recompile them if I want. And that level, that I have the freedom to move. In the cloud, that sort of freedom to move is at a different level. It's at the API level. And in your example of Flickr, you were tied into Flickr's value-added services, them as a vendor, but you always had the opportunity to bring the investments you've made out of the cloud because of the APIs.
With all due respect, if the data on its own had the equal value of the data in the service, there'd be no point in having the service. Additionally, I think you made the argument that with Linux you can move things around. Well, that argues for open source, not against it.
No, it says that open source is what does it in the operating system level. At the cloud level, it's APIs. And it's APIs that let you move from one place to another, because if it's an open API, somebody else can come along and either implement that API or implement another open API with equivalent services behind it that lets me move that data. Now, the fact in Flickr's case that nobody else has done it is irrelevant to the issue. The lock-in is because Flickr's the only one who's done it, not because not an issue with open APIs.
I think if you write an app that you're talking about the data. I'm talking about the application that builds upon the API. If the app builds upon the Flickr API and no one has a competitor, then the situation
I think you're redefining lock-in in a way that makes it impossible for your argument not to be true. And the example is Twitter. Let's say you pick Twitter. Twitter were totally open sourced. Everybody else could go stick up Twitter equivalents. I move my data, all my tweets over to it. Then I don't get the experience of Twitter because all my friends aren't on there. That's not a meaningful use of the term lock-in.
I think it's an entirely meaningful use of the term lock-in.
Sorry, don't mean to take away.
No, that's okay. I've just got a quick question to ask. Because the principle of reverse engineering is established in law in the US and the UK, so that if anybody produces an API, even the DCMCA Act has stuff that you can re-implement it for basically interoperability reasons. Can you actually own an API? Because if you can't own an API, how on earth do you open it?
I would argue that you can't own an API. I don't know that the law is settled on that, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but...
Well, George, that leads right up into my question. Stephen's talk this morning was all about how lock-in happens because it generates money for the company that manages to achieve it. In other words, the driver for it is cash money. And what I didn't hear in your exposition earlier was what the motivation would be for a provider to participate in the ecosystem that you described. Where's the cash money in it for a provider?
First off, the objective of every business is to achieve lock-in at some level or another for something. So on the strong terms, he's looking at every organization is looking to achieve lock-in. And so by definition, using any service is going to have a certain level of lock-in. But go back to your question.
So you were painting this picture of where all these different providers would use the same API, and therefore I, as a customer, I understand the customer's perspective that you were describing. So
as the vendor, the reason is because this issue of business continuity planning isn't simply, when it comes to cloud provider stuff, it isn't simply esoteric stuff. I mean, this is SOX compliance basics. If you are locked into your cloud provider, you are failing on a compliance level. So as a cloud provider, you have to be able to offer your customers some sort of meaningful story about how they can, in the event of disaster or business failure,
So you're saying this is a clear customer demand,
Yes.
and in order to meet it, the providers are going to have to behave.
Yes.
Well, just to go on that, I mean, look at the use case today, and maybe I'm looking at the actors too simply. If you've got a London and Tokyo data center, private, all your own, you can't keep anything in just one spot.
Right.
You just have to, right? So if you're using London and Savis, managed service provider, cages, metal, direct leased lines, complete physical isolation, you can't keep anything in one spot. I mean, that's where I kind of come down towards George in that the actors here are files. I think files, right? Whether it's your VM files, whether it's the software installed in the VM files, and the files you have in the storage, those are all things that you can create equivalents actually pretty easy somewhere else. We're just at the early part of this where like people up here have read the book before everybody else. But at the end of the day, interoperability is these are files.
I think it's also processes. APIs get into processes in the way that a lot of other things don't. And while you know, implementing your application to one API or another API isn't particularly hard, and I think the rise of the adoption of EC2 proves that. It's still lock in to that API. At some point, you may have to go and rewrite it. And I'm not saying that that's not a fair trade-off at times. It may well be, but it is a trade-off.
Well, it's back to the point. I'm talking about infrastructure as a service, obviously. And again, we didn't differentiate here as we started.
Well, let me ask George a question. You know, we obviously talking about, you know, kind of the importance of an open API, and I don't think anybody's really going to debate that. But let's say that I'm a startup, and I've started in a cloud. It doesn't really matter which one. And over time, the economics are no longer favorable to me, you know, from a public cloud standpoint. So I want to go private cloud. Right? What I heard from you was basically that, you know, for example, in the case of an Amazon, you know, I can host Windows, and hosting Windows in Amazon, you know, is a lot different, or is very similar than it would be to hosting in Rackspace. So that we do have some portability on that layer. You know, so as long as I can spin an instance up and spin an instance down, I have that portability. My belief is certainly that, you know, these environments like an Amazon, like a Rackspace, and so on, actually add a lot of value. And what they have been able to assemble, their stack adds a lot of value. So if over time, you know, the public cloud becomes no longer economical for me, and I decide to bring it back in-house and to go private cloud, what good does an API do me at that point in terms of recreating that infrastructure?
Well, it actually does you a ton of good. So let's say you've got something in the Amazon cloud that's deployed. You're using Chef to configure the servers. You're using the Amazon API to control the provisioning and deprovisioning of the environments. Whatever you're using there can be brought into your internal data center, and you can talk directly to vSphere. You can use software like my company's enStratus to do it automatically for you. That's a proprietary solution, so I haven't been wanting to go down that path.
But in other words,
but
I have to go and recreate every piece of that infrastructure, correct?
Well, no, not at all. That's the whole point. You just need, it's the infrastructure is cut, exactly. So all you need is a baseline, a VMware template, even bare metal with baseline OS and the APIs and tools that are out there, both open source and proprietary.
If I understand correctly, your argument is you're not locked in because you can go and rewrite a portion of it and then you can move. But that surely is the very definition of lock-in.
No.
You need to rewrite a portion.
It's like Java. It's like your code. If you code your infrastructure like you code your applications, you have some level of freedom.
Sorry, can you
full
repeat
freedom.
that?
Yeah, I mean, what George is saying is that if you design your infrastructure like you design your applications, right? Yeah, there's still work involved. Right, we're never going to get rid of that. But the idea of, like what you said, having to individually install and recreate your infrastructure, it's more of it's like a push a button and drive it, very much like you compile an application.
I think you make a valid point, but I think that's similar to saying, you can, because SQL is roughly the same, you can switch Oracle to Sybase really easily.
It's not it at all. You can take an existing infrastructure and use the processes you have in place for managing that infrastructure and decide tomorrow, I'd just rather that be in the data center, flip a switch, and it's done.
So
there's a liquid base, right? It's an abstraction for databases.
So I have to ask that if all my data's on Salesforce, my saving grace is the fact that it's got an API. If it shuts down,
I don't consider Salesforce's API as open.
We have one comment to be made and hopefully one question from Simon Phipps. So, Krishnan, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
My name is Krishnan and I write about cloud computing and open source.
Well, hang on a second. Let's make sure the.
My name is Kush, and I write about open source and cloud computing at cloudlab.com. I have a comment to make. It's more of a philosophical reasoning than a technological reasoning. Okay, I think it's not open API versus open source. It's open. In cloud computing, it is open API and open source. The reason is, let's take a hypothetical situation where we take open source out of the picture. What is going to happen is we are going to have a handful of monopoly players playing the cloud computing game. And they have no reason, when they have the monopoly like market share, they have no reason to open up their API. But if you put open source into the picture, it not only helps people in countries where there are regulatory requirements to have cloud in their own country, it also helps make the playing field more competitive. So I guess having open API as well as open source is very crucial for the very success of cloud computing.
So we have the comment, which is we actually need both open APIs and open source. Of course, the question was whether open APIs is enough to prevent locking. Simon.
Absolutely. I'm Simon Phipps. I'm a director of the Open Source Initiative, so you can guess what I think. I wonder, my question, of course, because I've got to have a question, is, George, did you draw the short straw here? Because you're so obviously wrong. The deal is that an API in and of itself is insufficient because an API is also accompanied by a behavior. And unless the behavior is defined in addition to the interface, then it cannot possibly be adequate to prevent lock-in. Now, you mentioned Twitter a moment ago. I'll give you an example from Twitter. There is indeed an open source peer of Twitter called Identica, which is an implementation of StatusNet. It doesn't work as an interoperable peer of Twitter because Twitter has some behaviors that result in it not posting notifications back to StatusNet when StatusNet originates messages. The API is completely open, and from a superficial observation, you would believe that you would be free from lock-in because of the API at Twitter. And yet, Twitter is able to dominate and marginalize Identica because the behavior that is exhibited behind the API does not permit lock-in-free activity. So I'd like to suggest to you that an API on its own is obviously inadequate to prevent lock-in. There has to be some definition of the behavior, be it an open format, an open standard, or an open source implementation.
So George and James, would you both like to respond to that?
I feel like Lincoln, or the guy that spoke before Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address. Thank you.
The issue with behavior is it's up to the other providers of or implementers of the API to implement the behavior in a way that is as compatible as can be with.
And how do they know?
How do they know? They know what the API does in the other clouds.
And how do they know that?
What do you mean, how do they know?
Well, in addition to the API, they need a definition of the behavior that the API is there to encapsulate.
They have the documentation for the end vendor. In the case of Amazon APIs, the Amazon specifications. Right. Twitter's a lot more problematic than the behavior issue. It's about the issue. That issue is about the fact that you can't replicate the entire set of users. It's not because Identica has behavior issues.
I'm suggesting to you there is a behavior of Twitter that makes it impossible to avoid lock-in, which is that Twitter doesn't propagate tweets out to other peer providers. So there is a behavior associated with the API that means that lock-in is always present to Twitter. Twitter is a roach motel for instant messages.
And in that case, I would actually argue that the API isn't that open. If it's not, so that's a different.
Did you think it was an open API before I suggested this?
I actually don't know anything about the Twitter API. So yeah. So when you're telling me it behaves differently, I don't know what you mean.
We have another question here as well.
I'm not sure it ends up as a question, but I think we're neglecting reality, and I don't think APIs or open source are sufficient to avoid lock-in. The true lock-in is the data. When you have petabytes of data in one of these services and you can't get it out of there before the heat death of the universe, then you're locked in, and that's your situation. And it doesn't matter how open the APIs are or if they match the behavior on some other side, you're locked in, and that's the end of the story.
There's absolutely no question that scale is a feature, and it's a feature that allows you to be locked in. Absolutely.
George, did you want to respond to that?
I think data, the big unsolved problem of the cloud is latency and big data, so I'm not going to touch that one.
Well, hold on. Hold on, I have to come in here. I mean, this is not unique to the cloud.
Right,
again,
yes.
Big data and state is the monster. And every time I turn around, somebody says, oh, and whoever just came up and did it, oh, if you have petabytes of data, you can't get it out. It is the same with your London and your Tokyo data center. If you have petabytes in your Tokyo data center and it's the only place you keep it and that building burns down, you're screwed. The big state is not, it's in the numerator and it's in the denominator, so it just factors out of the equation. I'm not saying you don't have to deal with it, but it's far from unique to the cloud, and it's the omnipresent problem of enterprise computing.
And I guess to that end, it seems to me that the argument against open APIs as the mechanism for avoiding lock-in seems to be from you and Simon is this idea of redefining lock-in to be that which you can't do for whatever other reason.
No, I see where you're coming from, and that's a convenient argument.
Yes.
Similarly to my definition of lock-in being quite rigorous is convenient for me. But I think we have to be honest. If you develop to an API, that piece of code is locked into that API. It just is. And while it's great that competing services are out there, to move to that competing service, something has to be done. Action has to be taken. And if you have to take action, there's an element of lock-in. And now, there's no question we can argue about the scale of the action. There's no question that we can debate the value of that lock-in, but you are locked in. And I just think that to not accept that and to not admit to that is somewhat intellectually dishonest. Sorry.
And also,
but by your definition, if I program to any particular Perl or Python API, I'm locked in.
Yes, to that API, yes. Okay. Absolutely.
Well, I would also add, I think one of the pieces that we've been talking about sort of offline here is kind of that we're generally speaking in terms of infrastructure as a service, non-platform as a service. And I think the implications from a lock-in perspective are materially different. In the sense that, can you recreate vast portions of the Amazon infrastructure? Yeah, you probably can. If you know what you're doing, if you know how to do that, and certainly if you pursue what John is talking about in terms of infrastructure as code. But the further you go up the stack, and the more that those platforms are doing for you, and the more choices that those platforms make for you, just having an API into that is not nearly sufficient. In other words, I cannot go and re-implement Bigtable if I deploy it to Google App Engine.
Yeah, I'm not sure where Simon went, but he and I had a Twitter discussion when Google came out with their Java API on that. It said their Java API, in my opinion, and I can't remember where he falls in this argument, it actually locks you in to Google App Engine in a way that...
And I think that's right. And I think that there's an argument to be made that... I don't know if the folks in the audience are familiar with learned helplessness, which is a Pavlovian study where you can basically train animals to be helpless in certain circumstances over time. And there's a concern, certainly from a certain segment of the developer population, that the more that they use and leverage platforms, to achieve scale and so on, the less that they learn how to do some of those things. So at a certain point, even if you have the API, and even if you can recreate the environment, you've never learned how some of these basic pieces that are being done for you in platforms work. And therefore, it's a very subtle form of lock-in, and it's a trade-off that many developers choose to make. But, at some point, you may well be locked in.
So we are coming to the end. So what I'm going to say is, first of all, thank you very much, George and James, for presenting the arguments around our open APIs enough to prevent locking. Please put your hands together for George and James.
George, thank you.
And now we turn to the jury. It is your time to decide, are you
solemn
for
duty
or against the argument? Are open APIs enough to prevent locking? Yes or no?
So I'm pretty firmly of the opinion that lock-in is a result of some sort of competitive advantage, or to use Ben Black's term, utility. Somebody provides something compelling, and it's that compelling thing that locks me in at the end of the day. Amazon's really good at what they do. They're world champions in capacity planning, for example. And when I deploy my own little eucalyptus cloud within my data center, if I'm not as good at capacity planning as Amazon is, I won't have the same degree of functionality, even though I'm getting some degree of compatibility via the API. I found James's arguments more convincing, so he gets my vote.
So 1-0 to James. Stephen.
I'll just second that. I think, there's no question to me that an API is not sufficient to prevent lock-in.
2-0. Pat.
Despite my automation vendor glossing over at the top, I tend to focus, like I said, on infrastructure as a service. But I think the higher you go up in the stack, I think it's infrastructure as a service is the most self-service in terms of anti-lock-in. As you move up, I think James is making real points. So sorry, George, I'm going James.
Short straw.
So after I asked my question, I thought for sure it was a no-brainer for George, and then there was hope for some of the questions. But I still have to stick to infrastructure, infrastructure as a service, and I have to say that it's the best we have, which is abstraction of APIs and the ability to rebuild infrastructure in a certain way. So I have to go with George.
So that's 3-1 to James. James win. And George, we know that you did draw the short straw here, and that you did a very, very fine job of presenting the argument. So please put your hands together and thank our jury and our presenters.
Well,